development. Welcome also if you're watching on our live webcast. We're very happy to see you all and to have you watching as well. It's our pleasure today to welcome Dr. Arvind Subramanian, who is the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India as of last October. For us, this is like welcoming home family. Many of you will know that Dr. Subramanian is a Senior Fellow here at CGD and also at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, both here in Washington, D.C. He's currently on leave from both. And if that wasn't pedigree enough, in 2011, he was included in Foreign Policy's list of the 100 top global thinkers, along, I'm very happy to say, with our very own Lant Pritchett and our President Nancy Birdsall. Now, I have to just point out that that's quite a big talk up, Arvind. Your stellar career isn't without its pitfalls. Just last week, in fact, you revealed to students at India's National Institute of Bank Management that you failed India's equivalent of the Foreign Service exam, and that over your career you've had more academic papers rejected than accepted. So there's hope for all of us. But let's welcome Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Great to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, I think how this will work is that I want to have as much time for you to ask questions as possible. So what we'll do is that I'll just kick off and I'll split the conversation into four broad areas. And the way I've kind of sort of categorized these are economic realities, economic priorities, requirements for inclusive development, and India and global cooperation. So if you have a question to ask, think in your mind which of those categories it would best fit into. And as we move through the event, then please put your hand up at the relevant point. So Arvind, if it's all right with you, let's start. Now, at the event, when you talked about those few failures in your career, you also made a point. You compared India to a precocious child. A precocious child, you said, does things far ahead of its time. You argued that the Indian economy is a very precocious economy in both the good and the bad sense. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I think of the Indian development model as absolutely unique in two senses, or rather a combination of two or two and a half things. Precocious. I call this the precocious development model because politically, India has sustained democracy well ahead of what countries at that level of development with low levels of education literacy are supposed to. So politically, it was far ahead of its time. Now, that's the political precociousness of the Indian development model. The other is the economic dimension of that, which is that, most countries escape from underdevelopment, either, at least initially, either through natural resources or by doing relatively unskilled manufacturing and then graduating to other things. So, and India is trying to do that by actually defying its comparative advantage and trying to do this through a skill-intensive model of development.
But its comparative advantage is unskilled labor.
Yeah, because we have 1.2 billion, whatever. So I think this. And it's India is kind of provisional in terms of whether it's a success or not is still to be seen. But if it pulls it off, if it kind of transforms itself, then it will have done something that almost no country has done, i.e. Starting off as a democracy and following a comparative advantage, defying model of development. That combination, I think, is quite unique. I said 2.5. I'll come to one thing you said. I think there's a social dimension to this, which I think is very interesting, which actually a paper by Devesh and Lant have pointed out that, India, there's a lot I think needs to happen in terms of social change. But there's one dimension of social change, which is, how the Dalits are doing in India, the so-called untouchables. And what work by Devesh shows is that, their social status has got transformed much quicker than, say, social phenomena like feudalism were broken, going back 150, 200 years.
What's the reason for that, do you think?
And their reason is that basically it's a combination of, Indian democracy that's empowered these people via the political process, affirmative action, but above all because of rapid economic growth since the mid-80s. So a combination of that means that social change in some dimensions, not all, has been pretty rapid.
But in terms of that precocious nature, what do you think are the implications of that for India's future development?
Well, I mean, I think there's good news and bad news. I think the bad news is that this comparative advantage defying model of development means that, we don't absorb unskilled labor as much as we ought to and as much as the country needs. So that's the downside of this skill-intensive model. I think this one small upside of this has been that educational attainment, educational outcomes have improved more rapidly than they would otherwise have, because the skill-intensive model of development has actually created a demand for education. The supply of education in India was always traditionally weak, still continues to be so. But because of this premium on tech skills, low tech skills, on English language, and so on, people have gone out and sought to acquire this education, and so that's been one of the upsides of this whole precocious development model. So I think how it's going to turn out, let's see. But I think it is a very, very interesting development model.
Right. Well, I said I was just going to kick off the conversation. I'm really keen to hear some questions from people. So if you have questions on the sort of broad topic of India's economic realities, put your hands up now. We have people with microphones who will be coming around the audience to allow you to ask those questions. Any questions from the audience? Put your hands right up in the air so I can see them, please. Lady at the front here, let's start with you. Just if you could say who you are, where you're from, and then ask away.
I'm Poonam Gupta. I'm currently working at the World Bank. Have been actually Arvind's subordinate way back, about a decade ago. So Arvind, really enjoyed your economic survey, fabulously written. And incidentally, I'm covering India for a bit at the bank. And one struggle is that even though one sees India growing very, very fast, among the drivers of growth, there is some kind of lopsidedness to it, right? It's coming mainly from consumption. And we also understand that for this growth to continue and to accelerate further, investment and exports have to pick up. So what in view are the challenges? And you have mentioned them in economic survey, but do you see them unbundling now? Do you see them picking up on the ground?
Yeah. Thanks, Poonam. That's a really important question. Take first investment and then we do exports, right? On investment, our diagnosis in the economic survey was that, in the boom years of the 2000s, basically, private investment grew very rapidly. Public investment also actually surprisingly grew about 3 percentage points or so. But then all that private investment, a lot of it was a punt on 8-10% growth continuing forever. That didn't happen. Lots of other things happened. It collapsed. Now, I think where we are, and I analytically for me it's really very interesting, because I call this the balance sheet syndrome with Indian characteristics. Private sector balance sheets are relatively weak in India, because if you look at the numbers, 1/3 of corporations don't generate enough resources to pay their interest. Private investment is weak. The counterpart is banking system is assets are relatively impaired, and so a combination of that, and third, exit mechanisms are not very effective in India, and fourth, the PPP model is somewhat in limbo. So going forward, the impulse of private investment is going to be, a work in progress. It's recovering slowly, but it's so that's why we said that in the interim we need a public investment push. So I want to be really insistent here is that our call for public investment is not the Summers-Krugman IMF new orthodoxy that there's demand deficiency and therefore you need more demand. This is very much a sui generis diagnosis based on private investment being weak, and therefore public investment having to fill in the gap for some time, not to supplant or to crowd out, but in fact to crowd in. Given what I said about the financing, there's absolutely no danger of crowding out at all, because in any case, banking system is not lending to the private sector as much as it should. So I think, but then when you say public investment, then the question is, do we have the capacity to invest, and do we have the public resource envelope? And that's where I think the whole macro framework for this budget, I think, was very interesting, where we said we will consolidate, but not as much as people expected or wanted us to do, consistent with this need to ramp up public investment. Capacity is an issue. That's why I think we're focusing on railways and roads. Railways are and I would say that to some extent we address the capacity constraint by saying that we're not calling for gazillion more dollars of public investment, but a modest ramp up, which can sustain itself going forward. So that's, I think, the way I see. And I think if public investment picks up and then growth picks up, some of the private sector problems will get obscured over time, and then hopefully will give us space to address some of them, and then we can see private investment coming back up.
Just on that point of growth, to interrupt you, sorry. Your economic survey, I watched an interview that you did on NDTV not long ago with Pranoy Roy. It was a whole hour about the economic survey. I wish we had programs like that here. I'm not sure how many people would watch them, but it would be very interesting to get to the real, in the weeds of the economic survey. It predicts 8% growth next year for India.
Between 8 and 8.5, correct. You're right.
And then double digits after that.
Well,
and your conversation was about how realistic that is.
Yeah. So I think that 8% number is kind of based on the new revision to the GDP growth numbers that our statistical office has produced. I don't want to get into all the gory detail, but essentially that our absolutely fantastic statistical agency, they've upgraded their methodology, they've expanded the data that they're getting, but the growth number, which was hitherto 5.5, was bumped up to about 7. So this 8 number should be viewed in the context of that bumping up. So I just want to place that in context. I think the important point, I think, to remember is that we expect reasonably, India is still a recovering economy, but in the medium term we expect growth to be amongst the highest in the world. The second point about exports, I think, is a really, really good point. If you look at the survey, one of the things that surprised me was that exports have stagnated. And not just manufacturing, but services exports have stagnated. And that's very worrying, and I think that it's going to be, so the external environment is a little bit challenging. And of course, all these new agreements that are taking place are going to further exclude us from these export markets, because not only are tariffs going to be greater for us compared to competitors, but standards are going to be very different. So I think this whole export challenge thing is really something we need to take very seriously. And ideally, we need double-digit export growth, and ideally it should be in manufacturing and low-scale manufacturing. But if you can't, at least we should maintain our services exports, because that dynamism in exports is an absolute precondition for rapid economic growth, and I think we need to focus. It also means having an appropriately valued currency, all those things, all the things that go into that going to be very important.
We're on the subject area of economic realities. Let's see if there's any more questions. Would you like to? Economic realities, economic priorities, requirements for inclusive development, and India and global cooperation. They're pretty loose. Don't worry if your question's stray. Don't worry. It was done on the back of an envelope early this morning. I wouldn't worry too much about them. Gentlemen here, if we can bring a microphone down here. Again, please say your name, what you do, and then ask Arvind. That's the name of the event.
Thanks, Rajesh. Arvind, Sanjeev Joshipura. I run SJ Consulting, which is a US-India-focused business and public policy consulting firm. Delighted to see you back here in Washington, even if it's for a short period of time. My question is regarding monetary policy. And I think it's fair to characterize the environment in India as being one of a little bit of tension right now between industry maybe and government on the one side, and sort of the more inflation hawks kind of monetary purists on the other side. And you read statements in the press, back and forth sometimes. Now, the backdrop against all this is that Raghuram Rajan himself has said a short while ago that the transmission mechanism of interest rate moves by the RBI is not really well oiled in India and needs to get better. My question for you, Arvind, and I'm not going to ask you about the level of the interest rates, because I know that an eminent economist like yourself would not really comment on that being part of the government. But what I do want to ask you about is, given that there's going to be sort of this more muscular monetary policy committee in Parliament, as I understand from the reading of the press, and given that the debt management function is being taken away from the RBI, what in your view, what does that bode for the future of monetary policy making in India in terms of the independence of the central bank? Thank you.
You've asked actually many, many questions rolled into one. Let me just say that first of all, show me a country where there isn't a fight between the inflation hawks and industry that is wanting interest rate cuts all the time, and I'll show you a fictional country. That's just I think par for the course. Um, I think that, over the last few months, look, we had 6-7 years of double-digit inflation. So clearly, but over the last 12 or so months, inflation has been on a downward path. And it's, of course, partly reflects oil prices, but I think it partly reflects also actions taken by the RBI, and I would also say by the government. So it's a combination of these three things that have, gradually brought inflation down. And, the central bank is doing its job, the government is doing its job. And I really think that going forward, what we're trying to do is actually codifying a process that's worked very well, which is, a kind of loose inflation targeting framework. And we have this in the budget, we have this monetary policy framework agreement with the RBI, where we set out the objectives and said, that's the primary role of the central bank. We're then going to then go the next step further and kind of rejig the institutional architecture, monetary policy committee, et cetera. But essentially, we're going to be, codifying the success of the last 12 months or so. And I think, the government, the RBI are all on the same page on this. So I think, how exactly the details will come out, how many members in the monetary policy committee, who does what, I think these are all finally matters of detail. I think there's a general consensus that, we want to bring inflation down. We need an independent central bank with a clear mandate. And I think that's the way we're going to proceed.
The gentleman was very polite and didn't ask you about interest rates.
Yeah.
I'm an ex-journalist. I'm not going to be nearly as polite.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts publicly about where interest rates should be?
See, in the economic survey, what we said was that inflation, we expect inflation to be below the RBI's forecast of 6%. That's exactly how it's turning out. And so we said that there's going to be room for monetary easing. And in fact, there have been two cuts of 25 basis points around the budget. And, I think that if trends continue, there's probably more scope for easing, but that will depend upon how the numbers come in. So I think, but, when, how much, these are things that, the RBI will decide and not us. But if current inflation trends continue, I think, there's a good chance that we will overshoot on the RBI's target, and, that has consequences for monetary policy.
Okay, let's get another question from the gentleman over there. Just wait for the microphone, sir. Sometime, today, Jens, that would be nice. Thank you.
My name is Safile, a student of Dubai University and from Sierra Leone, West Africa. My question to you is the India economy and the BRICS. Last year, India, Brazil, India, China, Russia, and South Africa decided to form the BRICS. I want to know from you, which role does the BRICS play towards that, the GDP of India? Because you have the World Bank, you have the IMF, the India, China, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa decided to form the BRICS. So I want to know the role of that bank to the development of India economy.
I think things like the BRICS and all these institutions that are coming up, have a substantive role in terms of, channeling savings from creditor countries to countries that need it. And they have obviously a political role, a strategic role, and so on. We can talk about the latter thing, but I think the important point is that for India, official international financing is a smaller and smaller part of our, of the overall savings that the economy is going to need. So we have access to private capital markets, remittances, all these other forms of financing. We have a domestic tax base, we're going to mobilize resources. So in the overall scheme of things, foreign savings, and especially official foreign savings, and within that, from non-World Bank related sources, it has a, you have to see that in perspective. It's not going to play, India's development, let's say, is not going to hinge on money coming from these agencies. But these are important things that are happening geopolitically, geostrategically, and I think India is going to play a very constructive role in all these new institutions.
Any more questions on this sort of broad topic of economic realities? Gentlemen over here. Great.
Hi, I'm Lakshman Ramamurthy. I'm not a global development economist. I'm somebody who's impacted by global development economics.
All the more welcome then.
Exactly.
To be here.
But I mainly came, Arvind, because you are a chief economic advisor to PM Modi. And those of us who are watching PM Modi and India are giddy with excitement with all the hashtag Make in India that's happening. I was hoping really there's like a two-part question. One is your forward-looking statements on any Make in India, how is that going to come along? And then the second part is my expertise is in the area of medical devices and genomics and so on and so forth. And PM Modi said recently he's going to have a medical device park, if you will, in Gujarat, because we import almost 98% of medical devices needed in India. If you could talk about generally Make in India and then talk about what should we look for the next 5 years in terms of making India competitive in this area generally. Thanks.
Yeah, in a sense, Make in India kind of summarizes the development challenge for India more broadly. I think a whole bunch of things need to go into Make in India, right? Infrastructure, the ease of doing business, labor regulation, land regulation. So it's a packaged thing that has to happen, and I think this government in the last 12 months we've made making a fair amount of progress on each of those things. Labor laws are changing in the states. There's a land bill which the government is trying to pass, pushing public infrastructure and public investment. That and insofar as governance matters a lot. I think a big departure from the previous regime was that the auction of spectrum and coal has gone off really transparently and with absolutely no glitches. So that is a signal that governance is very important. It's being reformed. So I think one way to think about Make in India, and I'm sure there are many ways of thinking about it. One way to think about Make in India is just that what are all the things that are required to make the Indian economy competitive, and it's the export challenge is part of that. So there's no one thing that if India succeeds, Make in India will succeed. Let's put it that way.
And that's actually a good point for us to move on to our next broad subject area. As I said, don't worry if your questions don't seem to fit in the broad subject areas, just ask them anyway. But the next subject area is priorities. We talked about how to make India competitive. When you were appointed in October of last year, this is what you told reporters. For any economy like India, the two big things are macroeconomic stability and, of course, creating conditions for rapid investment and growth, while creating opportunity for all segments of Indian society. No one should be left out of this process. Quite a lot of priorities there. It's quite ambitious. How's that going?
No, so I think take each of them. The first one, macro stability. If you think, go back to July, August of 2013, there was the taper tantrum, and in response to that, the Indian economy really came close to a full-blown macroeconomic crisis because inflation was in double digits. Our current account deficit, we were borrowing a lot internationally and therefore reliant on foreigners. Our gold imports were very high. Our fiscal deficit was high. Growth was decelerating. So the whole confidence in the Indian economy had evaporated. And 18 months on, the picture is really very, very different. So I think on macros, of course, again, helped by oil prices. But in terms of macroeconomic stability and resilience now to any untoward action internationally, I think we're much better cushioned and buffered. So I think macroeconomic stability, you never ever attain macro stability. There are always risks, but I think we're moving in quite a solid direction.
What's brought that extra stability?
I think as we just discussed, oil prices came down, and then we've taken a series of actions to bring inflation down. So all of that combined to bring down inflation. Bringing inflation down also meant that this hunger for gold that Indians exhibited, that's also come down enormously. So our current account deficit has come down, And then, we've continued the process of fiscal consolidation. It's come down by a little bit more. And generally, I think the sense that there is a government that actually will and can deliver, that I think confidence and trust, I think has come back, which goes a lot towards, and of course, as a result, capital has been flooding into the country. That's as good a sign that, investors are voting with their feet in terms of, validating all the stuff that's happened on the macro. On the other growth objective, Rajesh, that is something that's really, you got to plug away at that, on a really steady basis. And the question is, remember, just to highlight some of the reforms that are going to, I think, help growth. We spoke about public investment. India is going to pass, hopefully in the next few weeks, a kind of absolute major piece of tax reform. Think of the VAT. The VAT is going to be implemented all over India to cover goods and services, and not just by the center, by the states as well. It's a really a big reform. Requires changing the constitution, requires buy-in from the states. So it's really a major piece of political effort that goes into this, apart from all the technical stuff that you need to be prepared to implement that. And for 10 years, we've been saying we're going to do this, we call this the GST, goods and service tax. But, the political consensus was always proved elusive. But in the last, 3-4 months, finally we've got the political consensus, and we're going to pass legislation now. So that's a kind of a really big ticket reform. And then the other one, of course, is we're speaking about inclusive growth, doing much more of this direct benefit transfers to make sure that whatever help is provided to the poor is well targeted, reaches them with minimal leakage. Because once you do that, then I think you can also, liberate the economy from having to distort prices to provide these subsidies. So I think, a lot is happening, but, I don't know whether we should get into now, or someone will ask a question in this regard, or should I preempt the question and provide the answer myself, is that, always the question comes up is enough happening to achieve these objectives? Is it all talk and no action? And I think one thing I feel quite strongly, and we said this in the economic survey, is that, expectations about India leading up to this budget, were just sky high. If you remember, even the Economist cover said, "Will the elephant fly?" and so on. And I think, especially outsiders, I think had a somewhat exaggerated expectations, and somewhat at variance with the cross-country experience. I mean, cross-country, we know that big bang reforms never happen, really don't happen outside of a crisis. And big bang reforms in democracies such as India, where, with multiple veto centers, multiple levers of power being completely fused. So the big bang reform, I think, was a really unrealistic expectation. And I think,
but you just said this tax reform is effectively a big bang reform.
It's big, but it's not. It's not that we're kind of going to do all things at one time. I think that was the expectation. People said we have to ease the cost of doing business, do our labor law, do our land law, all kinds of things. And, so I think some measure of perspective is required in assessing how much India is doing and will do going forward. I mean, it's not an alibi for, or an excuse for not doing stuff, but I think that you just need to understand that this is a really, a Titanic of an economy and government apparatus. So, you have to, in assessing how it's doing, you have to keep that perspective in mind. And by that standard, I think, we're moving in the right direction.
Let's see if there's some questions on this point. Yes, let's get this question from the gentleman down here, and then the lady in the red shirt. Can we get a microphone to the front down here?
It's going to be a tough question. I know that.
Well, thank you, Arvind. This is Sadanand Dhume with the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal. I don't necessarily disagree with you, but since it's supposed to be a tough question, let me push back a little bit on. One of the terms that was really striking in the economic survey was this idea of creative incrementalism. And I agree that there is a glass half full interpretation, which is that, if you string together the various things that the government has done in terms of natural resource allocations and other things that are planned, such as GST, you really can make the case that quite a lot has happened. But the flip side of that is that, dismissing the idea of big bang reforms, sometimes it becomes a bit of a straw man, because I don't think that what many people call big bang reforms in an Indian context are necessarily some kind of, post-Soviet kind of there are things that people have regarded as feasible. So for example, cutting fertilizer and food subsidies. For example, a privatization program, for instance, that was there in the previous NDA government under Vajpayee. For instance, maybe rolling back something like the retroactive tax, which is widely regarded as one of the worst economic decisions of the last 20-odd years. So it's when these things that are not necessarily extremely dramatic, they of course would take a certain amount of political courage, have not taken place, that's where the argument that creative incrementalism is perhaps a way of not doing as much as could be done comes up. So I'd love you to address that.
Very great and very good and very tough question. Let me say on this, right? On subsidies, right? I think that the objective is going to be very much, let's focus on, in the first instance at least, eliminating leakage and waste. And there is a lot of mileage that one can get out of that. If you look at the survey, we list all these goods and services that are, distorted the prices. And we show how much of that doesn't actually reach the people it's meant to reach. So I think if you look at the table, and if you look at the last column in that table, take kerosene, for example, right? The leakage in kerosene is enormous. And there are three kinds of leakages. One is what we call phantom kerosene, which is that, PDS allocations of kerosene that don't show up in the numbers at all. Then there's a leakage in the sense that it shows up, but doesn't show up in the PDS. It's someone else is consuming it. And then there's a third kind that shows up, but doesn't actually reach the bottom 30-40% or so. So I think on average, the leakage defined as government spending that doesn't reach the bottom, take a number, 30-35%, is actually quite enormous. Now, we could have a debate about whether you should attack the 50-60% that leaks, or the whole 100%, including the stuff that doesn't leak. And I think it's completely defensible and legitimate and big, not just incremental, to say we will, in the first instance, address the 60%, because that's huge. So I would say, therefore, that the other term we popularized in the survey, creating the infrastructure, the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and mobile, the technology infrastructure, to be able to do the direct transfers, which will actually enable you to get that 60% big reform. I think that is what this government is doing, and cooking gas is in motion. It's that. So and then the challenge is going to be then moving from that to the other commodities. And now, Sadanand, remember that in this, again, the point, again, I don't mean this as alibi or excuse. These other things like food, for example, or even other, they have to be done by the states. So that means that this whole technology infrastructure has to be replicated at the level of the states. So I think in that sense, it is going to be a kind of slow process, because you have to do this. But I think bottom line, that the objective that we should cut leakages and get 60-70% of the benefit, I don't think is not doing big reform. I think it's doing pretty big reform. Privatization, you will notice that in this budget, we have actually increased the scope of privatization to include strategic sales and also industries that are not doing well. So I think that would be, another step that's going in the right direction. On tax, I would all urge you to come and listen to the finance minister tomorrow, who's speaking on the tax vision for India. And he's the expert on this, you should listen to him. But there too, I think, look, there's a real half empty, half full thing, and there's also the perception and the reality thing here. In terms of what, you've listed some of the things that have not been done, right? And I think you should take this up tomorrow as well. But there are also things that have been done. For example, going forward, no retroactive actions. Going forward, not going to impose MAT on foreign investments. very important Supreme Court decisions that have, High Court decisions that have taken that have not been challenged, which kind of give certainty to this whole process. So I think that's where we are on the tax thing, and so it's all a matter of how much you expect and how much can be done and how much you think is not being done. So I think that's tax is I think a little bit more tricky, and I think tomorrow you should come and listen to the finance minister to spell out what his views are on how much more will and can be done on taxes.
Let me just pick you up there on the point about subsidies. Is it possible, even in India politically, to remove subsidies on food? I mean, we know that the price of onions is an election issue in India.
Yeah, I think that I think the Prime Minister has said very clearly, and also the Finance Minister, that our first objective in this and is to reduce wastage and leakage and corruption in the process, and that's going to yield a lot of benefits. And then let's get that infrastructure in play. I think the point is that we need effective means of support for people in that. We've been doing it in very kind of distortionary ways. Let's do them in less distortionary ways. And then once we can do that, then we can talk about eliminating subsidies or whatever.
But if the leakage is up to 60 or 70%, then that's more than a leak.
Yeah, exactly.
That suggests it's wildly inefficient.
Yeah, and the whole direct benefit transfers is precisely aimed at that. If you can get these things going, then that's what's happening in the cooking gas case. We're finding already that leakages are coming down quite substantially because you can, firstly, ghost beneficiaries can be eliminated. That's a big part of it. And then, the whole diversion that takes place, that can be eliminated as well, because you can deregulate prices and then the incentives for arbitrage are eliminated as well. So I think that's the way forward.
Okay, I think we have some more questions. The lady in the red and then the gentleman in the front row here.
I'm Seema Paul from the Nature Conservancy. We are a pragmatic environmental NGO. We believe in what role nature can play in providing value for development. My question is about the natural resource sector, on which a large mass of Indians depend. Of course, there has been the move with the land bill. There have been 23% of India's land is classified as forests and controlled largely by the state. And there have been some interesting economic signals. There was a move in which I think CGD put out a blog praising your role in it, regarding the incentive to be given to states in the form of taxes plowed back to them based on standing forests. The second signal has been that the Ministry of Environment and Forests, their budget, the allocation for forests and wildlife has been slashed. So kind of a little bit maybe contradictory, but maybe also part of a coherent thinking. I'm not sure which it is, and I'd like some clarification. It's very clear that as India grows, and it must grow to eradicate poverty, we will have increasing pressure on land and natural resources. And I'm just wondering if it is possible for you to lay out what the grand vision is with respect to conserving the natural heritage while enabling growth.
Yeah.
Just before you start that question, just to point out that the person who actually wrote that blog about forests is sitting right behind you, Jonah Bush, right there, from CGD. Wait. What is India doing to preserve its natural heritage?
I should be really honest here. Is that I don't do environmental policy or natural resource policy and so on. So I think. No, this is kind of a little bit. I can't pretend to have an expertise that I don't, and also I'm in the Ministry of Finance, and not in the Ministry of the Environment. So I know
Finance Ministry impacts environment.
Yeah, it's and I know a little bit about climate change, but broader natural resources I think is beyond my pay grade. But I think your broader point is valid, that we have to grow while and preserve our heritage and our forest. We have to grow in a way that's also environmentally friendly. And you may have seen in the last few days, in fact, Delhi environmental pollution, particulate matter pollution in Delhi has been very high. And that's it's become a big part of the public debate. And I think that's the way it's going to change. There's going to be a lot of public debate surrounding that, and it's going to arouse people into action. And I think that the great strength of the Indian process is that there is this scope for creating public debate and public action, and we have a very activist and open judicial system that's willing to take on these things as well. So I think we're going to kind of I don't know, the grand vision obviously is we have to do both, but how you do them is something that we'll have to see how it plays out. And it's not something that I've really thought about very deeply, or have strong or clear views on how we should prioritize them or how much resources should be devoted to different things. But I think that the one point I will make is that if you see the parts of India that are relatively poor, I mean, those are parts where natural resources have had a big role to play, whether it's mining or forests. And I think one lesson is that if we neglect development, marketization, proper regulation in those places, then there can be serious consequences. So I think that's something that is very much in people's minds as they think about these issues.
I just want to pick up on a point about that. You talked about you work in the finance ministry, not in the environment ministry. But one of the changes that you made to the way tax revenue is allocated from the centre to states recently, which is what my colleague Jonah blogged about, is to give more revenue to states depending on the size of their standing forests. Now, was that done with protecting those forests in mind?
I think that part of the reason that was done, you see, we have this absolutely independent statutory body called the Finance Commission, which once every 5 years determines how much money should go from the center to the states, and the pool that goes to the states, how much should that be divided between the states. It's in that allocation between the states that this time around they said, forest cover should be a criterion that determines how much this pool of money is allocated between the states. And I think insofar as they've said that, the states that have more forest cover should get more money, I think it's going in the right direction in terms of, according priority to forests and natural resources. So I think that's from that environmental point of view, I think the effect of this decision is going to be positive.
Okay, there's a question down here from the gentleman at the front.
Hi, Arvind. Thanks for your talk. I'm Samander from IFC World Bank. I have a question on, I know you touched on the banks, impaired loans in the banks. Banking sector is apparently probably one of the key sector for the health of the economy. India's non-performing loan, nobody, I think, can come up with the right number, but it's kind of around 10% market is saying, and some people are saying it's going to go up to 15%. Why India, and it's more kind of a philosophical reason, why does state has to own 3/4 of the banks of a nation like a democratic nation like India, which is more into market-oriented policies?
It is a philosophical question. You see, but I think the question, if I may say that, I think the question is somewhat, I think, ahistorically posed. I think the question should rather be, given that the zeitgeist of the 40s and 50s was that, the government needed to play a big push in industrialization, and therefore, many countries around the world did that. So I think the question should be, is that still valid? And if not, how should it change and how rapidly it should change? I think that's that. I think because it's not ahistoric. I mean, some decisions were taken in the past, and it's a question of how you evolve from that rather than saying today, I'm sure if today there was a nation that's created and, they would perhaps make very different decisions about, how much the state should be involved in banking. So I think it's a question of, how you, in a manner that's politically acceptable, move beyond. So in the economic survey, we actually had some stuff on this. And the one point I would make is that if you look at the Indian banking system, I think the point to note is that India has public sector banks and public sector banks and public sector banks. So I think, in terms of all these indicators of performance, there's a wide degree of heterogeneity in terms of how they perform. So I think we need to have a differentiated, approach to public sector banking in India, and everything should be part of the mix. Policies on financial repression should be part of the mix. Ownership should be part of the mix. Exit should be part of the mix. So I think we need a really differentiated approach to public sector banks. But obviously, the pace will be determined by what's happening in the economy and kind of what are the political constraints around getting out of it.
Let's get another question from this gentleman on the front row down here.
Hello, Milan Brambat from the New Climate Economy Initiative and World Resources Institute, formerly of the World Bank. We met briefly when you came to present your book on climate change, Greenprint. I was the discussant for that. I've recently been working on a new climate economy report on India. I was kind of staggered to see the data on air pollution, urban air pollution in India. So something like out of the 30 worst polluted cities in the world, a staggeringly high proportion are in India. And this is something that clearly has a lot of economic roots in the problem in terms of energy pricing and so on. And it has major economic implications as well in terms of the impact on people's health and premature mortality. It's not something that seems to have played a big part in Indian economic policy making traditionally. Is this something that the new government will be taking more seriously and thinking about factoring into its broader economic policy making, especially also given the links with the climate change aspects and greenhouse gas emissions?
I think it's quite similar to a question we had earlier, but do you have anything more?
Actually, I do, yeah. So, yeah, it is similar to that question. But let me say three things on that, right? First, actually, the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago launched this, monitoring. So, and I think this, it's the Dracula effect. You shed light on the problem, I think there'll be much more action. And in a democratic system like ours, I think that's one. Point number two is that something we say in the economic survey is that in the last 6 months, as oil prices have declined, we have actually taken a lot of action, unlike many, many countries in the world, including the US and Europe. We have actually passed on only a part of the oil price decline to consumers, and we've imposed these taxes, excises on diesel and petroleum. So in a sense, we've moved from a carbon subsidy regime to a carbon taxation regime. And our calculation is that petroleum now, we're taxing at something like $70 a ton of carbon dioxide, which is pretty high, much higher than. Second, we've doubled the coal cess. I think that's another thing. And then, of course, the Prime Minister is very serious about the solar program going from 20 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts. So I think on the whole climate change side, I think we're certainly moving in a very positive and the right direction. But I suspect that this whole pollution part of it is going to become a much bigger part of the debate going forward. And I think you can probably expect to see more action on that.
I think that's a good point to move to another section, which is about global cooperation. Yeah. Let's talk about India and global cooperation. And a question related to that is about climate change. This comes to someone who's viewing on our webcast, asking, can you give us any insight into what India might bring to the climate summit later this year on its own program to reduce emissions? And what in the run-up will it be asking the US to do beyond whatever the Obama administration has already committed?
Again, that's not a question that I can answer because there's a whole internal process that's going to come up with what we're going to offer in Paris. But I think the broader thing is that now, given all the stuff that we've taken, which I've outlined, I think India can play a very constructive and positive role in the climate change negotiations. And on the cooperation side, I mean, I think if you, this is something that we said in our book, Aditya Mattu and I, that in terms of cooperation, I think, we've done all these things. We're working to eliminate energy subsidies. We're taxing petroleum and products, doubling the coal cess, solar program, forest cover, as Jonah said, we're doing this. So the question is that what it is that, the international community should do to make all the global arithmetic add up. And I would say that two important asks for India would be, that the world should put a price on carbon, especially the US and the Western economies, because that's what's going to, provide the impetus to, developing carbon-saving technology. So I think putting a price on carbon, and as I said, it seems like we're going in the wrong direction in the US and other places, because oil prices have come down 50%, and pump prices have come down by an almost equivalent amount. So we're moving towards more subsidizing carbon in some sense relative to some benchmark in industrial countries. So I think we need to rectify that and really quickly get a price. The other, I think
Western economies should do something to stop the slide in oil prices.
No, not. I think that if remember, international prices are determined by demand and supply, but the question is that
slap more tax on.
Yeah, exactly. Because after all, the consumer was paying 50% more a little while ago, and now he's paying. So all the the progress we'd made on energy conservation, finding better, cleaner technologies, might go into reverse if this continues. And unless we get offsetting action in the major economies, I think the climate change arithmetic doesn't add up. I think that's the first point. I think the second important point, which would be a big ask, is that under most scenarios going forward, countries like India and China and Australia will continue to rely a lot on coal. And so pricing carbon is the first step. And the second step is that we really need to go on a war footing globally to get technologies that make coal cleaner. I think unless we make coal green and clean, I think this is going to be a kind of uphill battle against, because again, I've not looked at these numbers recently, but my sense is that renewables, while very important going forward, are still going to be only one part of the mix for countries like India in terms of energy sources, and coal is going to remain a big part of our energy mix. And so unless we clean and green coal, the emissions arithmetic globally will not add up. So I think the cooperation we need is pricing carbon internationally, like I would say we're doing in India now in the wake of the oil price decline, and devoting a lot more attention to technologies that make coal green.
But making coal green is going to make it more expensive.
No, so the point is that we need technologies that make green coal competitive. That's what we need. We have the CCS technology, but it's very expensive technology. So we need, and it's a sense of, I think, where we are internationally, that we don't even know what the alternative CCS are, because there's not enough effort that's going into R&D and this to make coal green. I think the world is, I think renewables are great, et cetera, and we need to focus a lot on renewables as well. But we can't neglect coal, because coal is going to be a big part of the equation.
Let's get a question from this gentleman down here. Otherwise, I'll just carry on chatting to you about this. And there's lots of other people that we want to get the chance to ask questions to.
Well, I'm just going to, hi, Claudio Lilienfeld. I am a consultant here in Washington, D.C. And I'm actually going to pick up on that. Arvind, you have spent some time with us a couple of days ago, and there was a conference Carnegie had yesterday to talk about pharmaceutical cooperation and U.S. innovative companies licensing to Indian partners to sort of take advantage of India's ability to supply at scale innovatively in the world. And I think that one of the things that's missing with India in its economic diplomacy, or its inadequate economic diplomacy, is incentivizing more of the sorts of collaborations that you just raised in the coal side, I think is true for the pharmaceutical arena, and taking advantage and harnessing all of India's assets, not just the Commerce Ministry and perhaps not just the Finance Ministry or the External Affairs Ministry, but the Health Ministry and others, to be effective diplomats, to promote what ultimately is a Make in India narrative, but that also addresses some of those public policy issues like clean tech, for example. And I think the tying of American and other innovative technological R&D driven companies with India's lower cost and perhaps more efficient manufacturing can not just support India's public policies domestically and its market, but globally, particularly in the developing world at the bottom of the pyramid. And I was wondering if you could just comment on what the government may be thinking about how it can ramp up those efforts in a much more proactive way.
Claudio, I don't deal with patents and pharmaceuticals. That's
actually much more broadly
yeah.
than pharma and patent. I'm talking about just the whole idea of enticing that kind of technology collaboration to serve the world.
Yeah, see, I think that, if you look at FDI policy in India, for example, it's become much more liberal. So I think certainly what you're saying, getting FDI into the country. I think the flip side of that, or a complement to that, is going to be, just the whole easing the cost of doing business, making taxes more friendly. I think it's that agenda of, making India a much more business-friendly place, environment, creating that environment, will then naturally lead to the kinds of things that you're talking about. So I think, if we can get that going, the rest will follow.
I think we had another question. Oh, all the hands have gone up now. Let's get this gentleman first of all here in the blue blazer. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Parith Yadav. I go to school at GW. It seems there will be a shift in the economic center of gravity from the center to the state. So in this situation, are the states equipped to engage with foreign investment? Is it the right time to make this change?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, because one of the, I think, big developments that's happened in India, including the last few months, is what we call the shift to more cooperative and competitive federalism. That, the Planning Commission was abolished and a successor has been created. And underlying that, the Planning Commission's, planning was, of course, something that, India is trying to move away from. But also it was, I think, a conscious effort to move away from a very Delhi-centric, Delhi-dictated approach to India. And then, we had these recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission, which the government accepted, which basically devolved a lot more resources to the states. Now, why is that important? I think that's important because India's, the dynamism for change, or the impetus for change, is going to come about very much through the competition between states. Different states are going to do different things. Some are going to work, and the good models are going to travel and be emulated elsewhere. And I think the states are acutely aware of that, because, I mean, just to give you one example, every state now does investment roadshows, not just domestically but also internationally. Even West Bengal actually, and the finance minister went and actually did an investor summit there. And West Bengal wants to attract investment. Can you imagine this? 10, 15 years ago. So I think the fact that competition between states is going to motor and power Indian change going forward, the fact that that's been that has been furthered, that process, by this government in taking many decisions, including accepting the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission to actually become more federal and devolve more fiscal power. I mean, this is a very desirable way in which India is headed. And I think this whole competition between states is a very, very powerful dynamic. It's happening. It's not just happening in terms of attracting investment, but in terms of how to deliver services better. Some states are doing it better, other states are going to learn from it, and that's the way things are going to change in India. So that's, I think, very important.
And is this shift coming from Prime Minister Modi, who of course ran a state himself very successfully?
I think that's one big part of it. I mean, and also the fact, because this is getting a bit technical, but the 14th Finance Commission actually recommended a radical increase in the fiscal resources to be devoted to the states. And because I think the Prime Minister and had, having come from the states, had this perspective, I think that helped a lot in, making this happen. So very much, think of India as the US, after the Civil War, sort of reconstruction, where, you really got, this dynamism unleashed because, different places did different things and attracted capital and talent and so on. So I think that's a very, very hopeful dynamic in India going forward.
Okay, and I think that was the tweetable moment to think of India like the US after the Civil War.
Yeah. well, if you want another tweet, I think that the real contrast is between, India today and the US then, and India not like Europe today. Europe is trying to centralize in a way that it goes in the other direction. India, I think, is much more trying to decentralize and unleash dynamism. Whereas I think in Europe, the periphery is kind of more fiscally profligate and macroeconomic. So that's why you want to centralize, because you're worried that more decentralization. And also, the big difference is that the core in Europe is rich. So there are all these fears about race to the bottom when you unleash decentralization. In India, it's the other way around. We still relatively poor. Therefore, we want the energy that comes from this competition. We want different states to attract investment and do all the things that are necessary to attract investment. In Europe, that's thought of as getting resources and things away from a rich core, and therefore putting downward pressure on living standards in the core. So I think that's very, very different in India now. So it's a really interesting model of federalism that India is kind of has embarked upon.
We have about 15 minutes left. Let's get one more question on the kind of broad topic of global cooperation, and then let's move on to our last section. Let's get the young lady over there.
Hi, I'm Marian Madsen with NHK. So I have a question more in the context of the IMF World Bank meetings happening in Washington this week. I know, and I wanted to ask you about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has drawn a lot of attention in recent weeks. And I wanted to ask you, what is India's sort of expectations for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and how does India see its leadership role in it, and how do you think it would continue to cooperate with the existing international institutions?
This is from NHK, the Japanese broadcaster. Okay, great.
This is, I think that we're seeing now a proliferation of these initiatives, and I think what's striking is that we're getting now these institutions with a different identity of leadership, right? And of course, to me, what's interesting about this is that there are push factors driving, and there are pull factors also driving this process. I mean, the push being all that's not happening on the multilateral development bank front. I think traditional donors really need to reassess how they are, what they're doing to the existing multilateral development banks, and I think that's driving this push. And of course, also we have the traditional, the what I used to call once upon a time, the rising rest and what is the appropriate way, the fact that power is shifting from this to it. And so India's role is going to be very much, try and strengthen multilateral institutions, try and be part and constructively engage in these new institutions, and and just participate actively and constructively in all these things. But I think India has also a very important stake and an interest in ensuring that existing multilateral institutions are strengthened and remain very active and so on, while working with all these new institutions. So I think we're just going to be actively participating in everything.
Okay, let's move on to our last topic area, which is requirements for inclusive development. We've talked a little bit about this already. I'm sure you'll mention it again, things like direct transfers. But one thing that really struck me is that now India has more of the world's poor than all of sub-Saharan Africa, which is an extraordinary thought. What does that mean for the country's development, and how do you help those people?
Is this based on $1.25 a day number? I mean,
yeah.
Firstly, I don't know that number because, we do poverty calculations very differently in India. I don't know how you should, and I don't know what the effect of the 2011 exercise is, whether that's true or not. But bottom line is that even we think we have still about 22% poor in India. And I think that, it's very clear that anything, and if you look at even the budget, that anything that we do going forward is going to be, emphasize this inclusiveness. When we wrote the survey, what we said was that, India needs double-digit growth because it has two important objectives. One is what we call, the wiping every tear from every eye. That's the kind of looking after the poor and vulnerable. And then, of course, you need to create opportunities for, what is increasingly young, dynamic, middle-class, aspirational India. But inclusive growth is, it's going to take several forms. First, of course, you need growth in general to create inclusion. I think that's a sine qua non. But also then focus on, direct benefit transfers. Now we have, in the new budget, we have, social security. The beginnings of a comprehensive social security scheme was announced in the budget. And also try and a little bit shape the pattern of growth. So I think the Make in India initiative is really trying to say that, creating employment opportunities for the unskilled, is kind of the best ways to ensure inclusion. And so you get growth, you have transfers and social protection schemes, and you try and influence the pattern of growth. I think it's a combination of these three things that I think can help address the poverty objective.
Seeing as we're in Washington and, we are now seeing candidates line up, announce their candidacy for the presidency in 2016, just with that in mind, what does India look for from the next occupant of the White House in terms of development policy? How crucial is it that the next occupant of the White House, whoever that may be, understands that they need to embrace a kind of holistic and strident development policy that also understands that helping developing countries make sense for the US as well?
Yeah. So when Mahatma Gandhi was asked, what do you think of Western civilization, he said that would be a very good idea. And I think that, I don't know, development policy, I think this is something that we need to think about, afresh. And because I think the whole, the traditional donors, have they kept pace with the changing realities of the world? It's to me a really open question. Certainly what I see from, what's happening on this whole the architecture of international financial institutions. It's not obvious to me that, we're kind of development policies, if I may, without hurting my, counterparts, American counterparts, say, I don't know. I feel we need to think, traditional donors need to think much more hard and carefully about. And that I'm hoping it would be, regardless of who comes into office, then I think it should be a part of it should be one of those bipartisan things that, just as foreign policy is considered traditionally to be a bipartisan issue, I think foreign development policy should be a bipartisan issue. And are you there, or are you there yet, or will you get there? I think it's a really, really open question. But I don't think necessarily we're headed in the right direction here. I think there's a great line from Edmund Burke, I think. I'm not remembering it correctly, but it's a paper that I wrote 2 years ago. It says that, the art of diplomacy is to graciously give up what you increasingly don't have the power to withhold in any case. I think there's a lesson here for, I think, the traditional donors, I think.
Wow, okay, great answer. Let's get a couple of questions on this point before we wrap up. Gentleman in the blue shirt over there.
Hi, my name is Prem. I work at Futures Group, a government development public health contractor. And I just wanted to see if you could expound a little bit on the new CSR policy, which I believe is on 2% of profits for private sector companies, as well as the just sort of the plan to evaluate the effectiveness of the program in reaching India's priorities.
You're talking about the Indian CSR thing, the 2% thing.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, you know, I don't know much about that, and you know, I really don't have much to say on. I don't know CSR very well in any case, so I study a little bit more, you know, more development policy and development finance. But corporate social responsibility is not my area of expertise, so I'm sorry, I really don't know much about that.
Okay, there's a couple of questions over here. I feel like I've neglected this side. Apologies. Let's get the gentleman next to Bill there.
Hi, Tom Boyke, Council on Foreign Relations, formerly CGD. What I wanted to ask was about trade. You mentioned before one of the headwinds India faces is its exclusion from regional trade negotiations that are ongoing now. What can be done to make India a more robust participant in those negotiations? How is international trade policy under the Modi administration different from the past, and how will we know whether those differences are succeeding?
No, I think the most important element in that is going to be that we have to domestically take up, you know, analyze and look more closely at, you know, what we need to do to increase exports. I think that's where we have a new foreign trade policy that, you know, makes export growth the kind of focus of this. And I think once we domestically come to a consensus that A, this is really, really important, and B, that it will require a certain set of domestic preconditions, I think that's going to be the most important thing. I think that externally there are things that can, you know, also shape Indian participation. I think a lot is going to depend upon how TPP involves, who becomes a member, you know, what role China is going to play vis-a-vis these groups. I think those are all also factors that will play into this. But above all, I think we need to have that strong domestic recognition, consensus that this is a really important subject, and therefore, you know, we need to do all that we can to, you know, or put it differently, it's the perspective is going to be, you know, export growth and export markets, and I think that's what's going to drive all of this. Can we? One last question.
One last question.
Because I need to rush my. We need to meet with our finance minister.
That's fine. That's fine. That's fine by me. I know you have a job. Okay, let's get one last question with the gentleman over here. Just wait for the microphone, sir.
Mike Delaney, Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. My question is about trade as well. Looking at as we look at this very welcome vision that's being laid out by India for its future role in the world, and I'm one struck by its comprehensive, thoughtful nature. It seems to me one of the missing links as we think about India's future in economic development is intra-regional trade. There's a conspicuous lack of intra-regional trade. And I haven't heard a whole lot about that. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on the current government's thinking going forward on whether this is important and to what extent India intends to address what I believe to be the lowest level of interregional trade of any region in the world, South Asia.
So you intra-regional trade.
So intra-regional
between
trade.
countries in the region or between
within South Asia, yeah. I think if you look at Indian foreign policy, and again that's above my pay grade, but at least there's a lot of emphasis on the neighborhood as well. You know, developing South Asia and the neighborhood. So I think economic cooperation is going to be part of that. Will be increasingly part of that. If perhaps it's been neglected in the past, but I think going forward, I think that's an area where I think at least from a foreign policy point of view, it's going to be very important. And so I suspect that therefore the economic dimensions of that are also going to become very important.
Okay, Dr. Subramanian, we have unleashed quite an onslaught of questions on you, but thank you very much for fielding them with skill. I think I speak for everyone in saying that we are very glad to see someone with your skill and insight in such a lofty position in the Ministry of Finance within India, and it's wonderful to have you here, and you know you always have a home here. Everyone, please give a warm welcome, a warm thank you to Dr.